welcome to Mormon Sex Info. This is Natasha Helfer-Parker, your host for the show. And for the first time, I'm going to give a few little announcements before I get started with our program. And I've been running Mormon Sex Info for 2.5 years now, and it's been kind of a bit of a different project than I had done prior to trying this one out. I've been a host for the Mormon Mental Health Podcast, and many of you would be familiar with that because some of my shows on Mormon Sex Info are actually co-produced between the two shows, especially when things have to do with sexuality and Mormonism. It's hard not to want to publish them on both podcasts. But when I started this show in particular, I wanted to focus specifically on sexuality. I wanted to focus primarily, not always, but primarily on professional, evidence-based, research-based information that would be very educational to the lay public who is listening. And I made this show subscriber-based and kind of following an iTunes model of paying for a podcast episode like you would pay for a song that you were purchasing, so that I could support the time that I spent on this podcast. So many of you have either purchased podcasts individually or have become subscribers, which I try to make very cost effective for the year. As a subscriber, what you enjoy is if there is a co-production with Mormon Mental Health, you always get to listen to that first before the other podcasters get to have access to that podcast. And also, of course, you get access to all of the podcasts that have ever been published on Mormon Sex Info. So it's definitely the better way to go, especially if you're just now tuning in to the show. At the same time, what I want to start doing, which will be a little bit of a new thing, is I do want people to have access and not allow cost to impede anyone from listening to certain material. So what I've decided to do is start kind of like an archive of Mormon Sex Info podcasts, since we have quite a few now. So if they're about 1.5 years old, I will start slowly, maybe every week or every other week, or maybe even once a month, turning some of the podcasts that were paid content into free content, so that you can share with your friends, so that more people can have access to them and listen to them. There's a lot of really great information that I want more, people having access to. And at the same time, I would hope that people find value enough in the podcast to remain subscribers, and they want the more relevant information that is coming out, on a fairly almost weekly basis. Sometimes it's 2 or 3 weeks before you get another interview, but I'm trying to commit to at least 40 interviews per year. So it's almost a weekly episode, and sometimes even more than that. So I just a few little announcements. Some of the older podcasts will be available for free. Feel free to share that information. Please support the podcast if you want this to be a project that I can continue to afford to offer my time and energy to. I really love all of you who have subscribed. I really appreciate your support. I get some really great comments and feedback. I know sometimes there are some issues with downloads because it isn't an iTunes-friendly podcast. And so I think everybody who puts up with some of the issues in regards to that and deals with downloading them through their emails. So I appreciate that. And without further ado, we'll just continue with our interview. So tonight, I'm really excited to start kind of a new little series. I'm hoping to have Tammy Ellis join me for about, maybe somewhere between 4 to 6 episodes. She is a social worker that got her degree from Utah State University. I'll have her introduce herself here in just a minute, a little further. But she is currently starting the process of becoming a certified sex therapist. And so I know many of you who have listened to me know that there is a difference between a certified sex therapist and a lot of, the majority of therapists out there who may dabble in or even refer out to other people because they don't want to dabble in topics of sexuality. And I think that most of you know that in my own background, I was fairly comfortable talking about sexuality as a marriage and family therapist. And then as I became more interested in the topic, had more people ask me questions, especially as I started writing a blog where a lot of the questions were sexual of nature because, people got to ask anonymous questions, and what better to ask anonymously than about sex. So I started looking into getting more expertise in that area and then having to really confront a lot of my own biases, a lot of my own ideas that I had thought were very correct and backed up by my degree. And it was really fascinating to me as a marriage and family therapist that I felt very well trained to then realize that in some areas, especially in sexuality, maybe I hadn't been as well trained as I had imagined or hoped, and that I had some real misconceptions that were probably causing unintentional harm or were causing me to not broach certain topics or had certain ideas about certain topics. And given my Mormon background as well, that was, a double doozy as far as having to check my own, just, where I came from. So Tammy,
Hello.
Hello. Thank you for joining me. That's a long introduction to get you on the show.
Problem.
Yeah. So Tammy herself comes from a Mormon background as well. And I'm going to just turn over some of the time to you as far as helping us understand where you come from, Tammy, where what was the path to social work for you, and then what even led you more towards the study of sexuality. So why don't we start there?
Okay. I'm going to try and put it all in a nutshell.
Yeah, that's a lot I just asked you.
Okay. I was actually born and raised in Southern California, and I didn't grow up in the LDS church. My parents are not members. Actually, my mom did get baptized a few years ago, but she's not in the church actively. I was actually 18 years old. I was living or actually 17 years old. I was living in Anchorage, Alaska, going to high school there, living with my mom. My parents were divorced. And I started dating a boy, and he was actually very good to me, and he was different than other boys. And he was LDS actually. And I didn't really know a lot about the church, but he introduced me to it. And anyway, eventually we both graduated from high school. We both moved back down to the lower 48. I moved back to California. He moved back to Utah. And he introduced me more, how do I say it? He introduced me to some other parts of the church that I wasn't aware of. Initially, it was the law of chastity. And he read a pamphlet to me written by Boyd K. Packer called Why Stay Morally Clean. And I thought it was so beautiful and brought tears to my eyes. I come from a family of divorce. My mom's been married a few times. My dad's been married a few times. And I just kind of related that. It was, I think, our general culture that somehow, some way, the sexuality thing was at the core of all their problems somehow. And I thought if I joined the LDS church and this law of chastity was also part of my thinking, that it would make it so that my life would be better and I would be happy and I wouldn't get divorced. And I was very naive.
So there was something that felt protective, or
yes, it had boundaries. It had, or how do I say it? Not boundaries. It kind of, I can't think of the word.
Expectations.
Yes, I just spaced the word, but
standards,
I guess you could say. Expectations is another good word. It was protective in a sense. Instead of me just running free reign, whatever I wanted to do, it had some, like you said, some requirements, I guess. And it felt safe to me, and it was an anchor. And in a lot of ways, it was good for me in that sense. And so anyway, I joined the church when I was 18. I went on a mission when I was 21 years old. And I thought, by the time I come back, I had it all planned out. I was going to marry this boy from my high school. His parents actually kind of adopted me, not legally, but just I literally spend Christmas with them and Thanksgiving with them still to this day, because they're like family to me, and they're very good to me. But anyway, long story short, I ended up getting married when I was 34, so a long time after my mission. And
not to this high school boyfriend.
And not to this high school boyfriend.
Okay.
No. I was still in the church, of course. We married in the temple, and we ended up in a big, beautiful $500,000 house. It was just beautiful, and the whole thing looked perfect. But as many things are, it was less than perfect. I can't go into detail just to protect his privacy, but we'll just say that we had problems, and we went to a therapist. This was several years into our marriage. We got married in 2004, and it was 2013 that we went to a therapist, Dr. Malin in Ogden, whom you know. And I decided right then my life is going to change. It's going to be better. It's going to be different. It ended up being much more than I thought, a much more of a change than I expected, but life is so much sweeter now for me. Let's just say that it was that point that being in an environment that was safe to talk about sex was something I wasn't used to. Okay. And I was glad, because it's almost like you want to talk about it, but you can't. And it was a safe place to be able to do that in Dr. Malin's office. And he would never laugh or shame or make fun. Sometimes he'd laugh with me, but he was always very professional, and the non-judgmental nature that I'd never seen before, not to that extent. It was something that always struck me, and it impacted me deeply. And I decided, you know what, I want to go back to school. I want to do this. And I was terrified to tell him and my husband at the time, because I was a dog groomer. I groomed dogs every day for a living, and to go back to school for a master's degree, that seemed crazy. But I did it. And it's taken me a long time, since 2013, to get where I am now, still working toward my licensure and specializing, or getting to where I'll be specializing in sexuality. So I don't know if that covered it.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's great. I love that. So there was something about the Mormon kind of perspective that at the beginning was very safe and protective for you, especially given maybe some of your family of origin story and how you at least had interpreted that story between your parents or things along that nature. You kind of buy into this idea that in Mormonism, sexuality and marriages are going to be wonderful and celestial. And as long as you do things the right way, I'm guessing that things will turn out, and you follow those guidelines and you'll be protected. Then things didn't turn out exactly like you had planned. Some of that maybe has to do with a sexual nature that you're not comfortable sharing, which is fine. And then you had this experience that was very powerful in your own life, a therapist who kind of was very effective in changing things for you, or helping you shift your thoughts and ideas about things. Is that a fair recap?
That was probably the best reflection I've ever heard.
Oh, okay.
You read between all the lines, all the gaps, and filled it in perfectly.
Okay, great.
Yeah, that was absolutely perfect.
Okay, to the point that it got you all excited to kind of change your own career path and start
Yes.
adventure.
I remember I was very burned out on dog grooming, but of course, in Mormonism, I slapped a smile on my face and pushed forward, put my shoulder to the wheel, and I was a good dog groomer. I won national awards. I was in the top 15 pet stylists in the country. I was
wow.
into it.
Yeah.
I know, kind of a weird thing, but whatever I do, I seem to push myself. But deep down, it was a way of dealing with my anxiety and my OCD issues that they were all beating into each other, my isolation. It was a very dark time in my life, actually. And so when my now ex-husband he sat me down and said he's going to go to therapy, I was like, praise the Lord, finally. We're going to get some help. And then when he handed me Dr. Malin's card, it said clinical sexologist on it. And I kind of laughed, sexologist, ha ha ha. And I thought, well, what else would I call it? Coitusologist? No, that doesn't work. And then at the same time, I had this feeling of sadness. And I thought to myself, you're a dog groomer. You'll always be a dog groomer. You'll never be anything but a dog groomer. And I put the card down and just kind of tried to forget that, I don't know why I thought I couldn't do anything else. But I did. I thought that's it. I'm just going to be the best dog groomer ever. And it just never left my mind, though. It kept bothering me. I really wanted to do something different. And finally, while I was grooming a dog, it just dawned on me, well, why not? Why not me? So that's kind of where that started. I wanted to back up a little bit, though, if I could.
Absolutely.
When we talked about, why stay morally clean, and that was what got me to join the church. And it's interesting because that was the thread that held me in the church for so long. And I acknowledge that I do struggle with issues in the church, but the main reason is related to sexuality. I also want to emphasize the good things that I got from the church. I don't think I ever would have gone to college had I not become LDS. It was such an influence for good as far as my education. On my mom's side of the family, I don't think anybody finished high school. On my dad's side, they might have finished high school, but that's it. So for me to even get a bachelor's degree was kind of like, wow, big deal. To go on and get a master's degree was unheard of. We don't do that in our family, So it really influenced me for the positive in that way. The community, the sense of community. But as far as sexuality goes, this is where it kind of turned south and affected me in negative ways. And it wasn't until the end of therapy, as far as sex therapy goes with Dr. Malin, that I realized that I was actually severely damaged and had not even put it together. But I think it was the first year that I joined the church in 1988, somewhere in that first year, somebody in, I think it was Relief Society, you know how they'll pass out little quotes. This one was from David O. McKay, and it was so impactful that I actually almost memorized it. I memorized the basic message, and I can repeat it to you now if you'd like.
Yes, please.
It was, the flower by the roadside that catches the dust of every traveler is seldom, if ever, plucked. But the one way up on the hillside, protected by a perpendicular cliff, the one with the virgin perfume, is the one the boy would risk his life to possess. And I was not Mormon until I graduated high school. And so I had some sexual experience. And when that quote was read, I had kind of two messages. One I repressed, and it was just a feeling of devastation. I'm not worthy. No boy will ever want me. I'm dirty. I'm no good. And then there was the slap a smile on my face. This is the true church. Suck it up, repent harder, and that feeling will go away. But that feeling never, ever went away. And it destroyed what self-esteem I had. I didn't have a lot of self-esteem, but it really impacted me negatively. It impacted my relationships after that. I couldn't have healthy relationships. I had zero confidence, and my self-worth was really impacted by that message. I didn't realize it though, because like I said, I'd slap a smile on my face, internalize the message and move on. But it was in looking back, I forced myself to realize that it really messed with my head, I guess you could say, and my sense of self-worth.
Yeah. And this is, I think, sometimes what we're talking about when we use psychological terms like internalized shame.
Are you there?
Oh,
I can't hear you.
Yes, I'm here. Can you not hear me? Hello, hello, hello. Hello. Hello, Tammy. Can you say something? Can you? Are we there?
There we are.
Goodness. That really sucks. I'm sorry. So I could hear you just fine, and it's showing that it's still recording, so it should be fine. Everything should be fine. I don't know why it kicked me out like that. Although I could hear you for a little bit, and then I think it just went out. So, all right. So, yeah, I think, what you're talking about is a psychological term that we use a lot. It was this idea of internalized shame, right?
Yes,
and so
very much.
Internalized means that it's so part of your own internal narrative that you're not really super conscious about it. And this is kind of one of those issues that happens a lot when we're talking to LDS members. Like some LDS members will say, yeah, I think that some of the messages that we got growing up were probably not super helpful, and they did shame me or they made me feel guilty. And then there's other LDS people who might say, that wasn't my experience at all. I actually felt really positive about the messages that were given to me. And and I don't ever want to dispute that, because I do think that there are actually some really wonderful sex positive messages in Mormonism that you don't necessarily find in other Christian sects. And at the same time, one of the things that happened in my life as well is that I used to be one of those that would just see it always completely from the positive lens. And it took me some time to dissect or, kind of separate the parts. Like I could still accept some of the positive parts, but then also accept that there had been harmful messages that did affect me, kind of like what you're talking about. And so that's tricky, right? Because you don't want to like discount people's experiences. And at the same time, there is kind of a call to the culture to say, hey, sometimes we're causing damage here by some of these quotes or some of these messages that can have this impact of internalized shame that some people may never quite, see as having been harmful, but it can still harm them in unintentional ways, or they eventually do see it and then can be very angry or very upset or feeling very betrayed by those messages.
Yeah, definitely. I do think you can get many things positive regarding sexuality out of Mormonism. I do think it is a protective factor in many ways for the youth. At the same time, we all know that, or you and I know, that in some ways it can be harmful too. I think it depends on the message. And like you said, it depends on the person. I was a really sensitive person, and my self-worth was always riding on the line a little bit. And that's all it took. And I just remember how I felt.
Yeah. Well, and it's a pretty, I hesitate a little bit with just excusing it in your behalf because you were sensitive, because this idea that somehow your worth as an individual changes due to your virginal status is actually something that I've heard a lot of people struggle with, over the years, whether they come from sensitive personalities or not. So yeah. Okay. So it sounds like these messages then are part of what you deconstructed in therapy for yourself.
Yes.
And also maybe started your interest, like you mentioned, wow, like having this really safe place to talk about something that can feel really taboo to talk about, and to have somebody actually listen and not laugh. I mean, you mentioned several things that were really almost like you were surprised that you had the space to be able to do that type of work.
It was something I hoped for before I met Dr. Malin, and I hoped that I wanted to have a safe place because I never had that before. Although my parents didn't raise me in a way that was, they didn't talk about sex at all. In fact, my mom, when I was about 9 or 10 years old, I asked her what a period was. And she said she got really uncomfortable, and she said, it's a dot at the end of a sentence.
Oh, wow.
And I was thinking, well, I know that, I'm like 10. And then as I got older, this is how shame really, I think, is learned, even unintentionally. But I put her reaction and menstruation together and went, oh, that's something to be ashamed of. And literally was ashamed of that because I just had no other role model to follow. It was never taught in a healthy way. And it wasn't taught in a healthy way to her either. So I grew up with sexual shame, and it just continued. So
Are you comfortable sharing whether or not your parents came from a religious background themselves of some sort, or was this a fairly secular upbringing that you had?
My mom her family is from the South, but not religious. And so just being from the South, I think there's kind of that overarching Southern belief in God and Jesus and all of that, regardless of whether you go to church. And my dad, actually, my grandpa, my dad's dad was a Baptist reverend, not the kind where you go to college and all of that kind of reverend. I don't know a lot about it, but when I stayed with my grandparents, which was often, we always went to church on Sunday. And there was definitely sexual shaming messages there. I remember my dad and the modesty thing, and the good girl, passive good girl kind of teachings, unintentionally, but definitely there.
Yeah, these are not unique to Mormonism.
No, absolutely not. I remember I put on some makeup once, and I was in high school, and he said, get that war paint off your face.
Right. So. Yeah. Yeah, in fact, that's kind of a whole nother topic, but I oftentimes think that Mormonism, actually the negative aspects in Mormon sexual culture are actually puritanical notions that we just adopted as part of the culture that are not super uniquely Mormon,
Correct. I agree with that.
So,
yeah.
Okay. So, so the reason why I have you on is because since I've been talking so much to people about, hey, make sure that you're when you see somebody, that you see somebody who's trained and has, a good background that would be able to offer you, kind of a healing space, not another unintentional shaming, biased place,
Right.
which can happen in mental health as well, not just in religious circles. So do you want to talk a little bit about, as you get interested in this field, what type of research do you do? How do you find the type of programs that you're wanting to spend time and energy and monies, on, and how do you end up at the University of Michigan, which is, I know, the training center that you're at right now?
Yes. Okay. So I realized that I wanted to be a sex therapist. And so I started trying to kind of dissect it and figure out, how do I go about that? Is there like a sex therapy school or something? The school that Dr. Malin went to was a little bit unconventional, and I'll just say it wouldn't meet my needs. And so I realized, hey, I already have a bachelor's in social work that I never used. Why don't I just try and get into the master's program at the U? And then someone else told me, they also have a program at Utah State. And I read about both programs, and I had struggles growing up with studying and learning, and I just felt safe when I looked at the application process for Utah State. So I applied there and I got in, and I was amazed because I was never a good student. I tried, but too many personal and home environment issues that I struggled with. And so when I did go to school there, I pushed myself and graduated with good grades and proved to myself that I could do it. And then I was still kind of struggling, like, how do I do this sex therapy thing? Because I want to do it the right way. And so I realized I could take all the classes through the American Association of Sex Educators, Counselors, and Therapists, AASECT, that you've gone through. But I wanted something that was more condensed, I guess, and in one place. But I didn't realize it at the time. I was kind of looking around, and I really couldn't find anything. And then Kristen Hodson here in Utah, she, as you know, is a certified sex therapist through AASECT. She had a little meeting for anybody who was interested in becoming a sex therapist. So I drove down to Salt Lake, and we all had dinner. And she mentioned a couple of places. Stephanie Bueller's, I think, is it the Bueller Institute?
Yes, she offers some classes.
Yeah.
That I actually help her teach, by the way.
Yes, that's awesome. I like Stephanie. She actually taught one of the classes at the University of Michigan. Just little sub class, I guess, as part of, I think it was Doug Braun Harvey's. Anyway, he had several people come in and speak. But anyway, Stephanie Bueller's Institute was mentioned, and she also mentioned the University of Michigan. And I thought, what? I've never heard of that. So anyway, I started looking into it more. I had looked at Widener University, but theirs is a full-on program, an academic degree. And I was already, getting my master's degree in social work. So I didn't want to get another degree. I already had that or was getting that. So when I looked into the University of Michigan, it was perfect because you can fly there and you also do online classes. And I'm in a situation where I don't have money rolling around, but I had, I knew I could make it work, and it was just perfect. It's comprehensive. It's an amazing program. I'm actually doing a dual certificate. You can do sexuality education, sexuality counseling, or sex therapy, or you can combine them. So I'm getting a combined certificate of sex therapy and sexuality education because I kind of think I want to teach in universities, maybe even high schools. So
let me pause here and just talk to the audience for a minute. It's super interesting that we really don't have degrees in sexuality. So in other words, most people will go and get their degree in, like you're saying, social work, marriage and family therapy, psychology, and then maybe have an emphasis in sexuality, which is what the certification process is really about. There are a few PhD programs that are in sexuality. However, they're not typical programs like you'd find at Harvard or, U of U, or they're usually private, and some of them are accredited, some of them are not. So it's, it's just hard to find just even the study of sexuality. When I was going through my certification, like University of Michigan's program either was just starting or wasn't even around yet.
Right.
The Beeler Institute wasn't around. In fact, Stephanie Beeler was my supervisor at the time. She just, she just started this institute. And there's also Ricky Siegel's program, Modern Sex Institute, down in Florida. So these institutes have been popping up as a way for people who are interested in going through the AASECT certification process, which is very in-depth, for people to be able to do that all kind of in one setting, instead of like I had to do it, which was, okay, I'm going to go to this conference, which is, presenting on this topic that I need to have, education on. And of course, AASECT conferences, will offer a lot of different types of topics so that hopefully people can do it that way as well. But these programs kind of developed in relation to AASECT's requirements. And I agree with you. I think the fact that University of Michigan has done this is phenomenal. Yes. But it's not, like you're saying, it's not a degree. It's a certification process that then, is an emphasis that you can be getting while you're getting your social work degree.
Yes. And they emphasize on the site, you don't become certified in anything. It's just a certificate. And then you can take all of that coursework and apply it to the requirements for AASECT.
Right.
And it meets most of them. And so when I'm done, I'll pretty much just need supervision, which I could start now, but I'm easily overwhelmed. So I'm kind of doing one thing at a time.
Right. And I'll be honest with you. I mean, I've thought about getting, going forward and getting my PhD, and it's just hard it's hard to commit to a program or a process that is not more integrated in the university systems,
Yes.
And so it's just, I think it's just for people to understand how we are still very much in the pioneering stage of sexual understanding, sexual study, sexual research, where, and a lot of programs, I think, also get concerned about types of research, or they don't want to bring certain types of attention, or it's hard to get grants or things around certain things that have to do with sexuality. So this whole field is just fascinating and yet difficult to study. And I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about maybe some of the own, as you started telling people in your social circles, hey, I want to become a sex therapist. Like, what was that like for you? What types of responses did you get to that?
Most people are positive and a little bit, what's the word, leery?
Mm-hmm.
Like, why do you want to do that?
Mm-hmm.
And in my thinking, it's like, well, why not? This is an area that, especially someone myself, where there was a lot of shame involved, and we don't talk about that. That's taboo. It probably made me all the more curious. And I think that's why that day when I looked at Dr. Malin's card and kind of giggled, but then felt sad, I realized that, there was something to that. And I really wanted to delve more into that. But at the time, I didn't feel safe. I didn't think it was a possibility for me. And then I realized, well, it is a possibility for me, and I'm going to do it.
Yeah, I love that you had that experience with your own kind of personal development.
Yeah, it was very impactful.
Yeah.
I never thought I'd be here. I honestly thought I'm going to be a dog groomer, and that's the way it's going to be.
Yeah, not to shame dog groomers. There's like, I know you don't mean to do that. I mean, you love your dogs and the work that you did, and there's plenty of people that are perfectly satisfied with that. But your point is, you weren't satisfied in what you were doing.
It was an escape for me it was a safe place. I didn't have a lot of confidence, and dog grooming, you honestly don't even have to have a high school diploma. You can hang a sign on your wall, buy a pair of clippers, and call yourself a dog groomer and make pretty darn good money, as I did when I owned my own business. But it was a safe place in that I was too afraid to, I had a bachelor's in social work, but I was too afraid to fail. I didn't have any confidence in my skills or abilities. And so it was a safe place for me where, I can do that. And that it was hiding behind something that was it's not easy. Once I got into it, I realized, oh my gosh, this is real. Dog grooming's much harder than I ever thought it would be to be good at it. And so it was hiding. It was hiding from a fear of failure.
Yeah.
And so.
Yeah. And I think that's an interesting, we could do a whole podcast on career development.
Yep.
From from the perspective of Mormon women. Now you do not have children, is my understanding, correct?
Correct.
So I know that for some Mormon women, that becomes part of the issue is being able to go back to school when they're also trying to be moms, to young kids or things like that. But that's a whole nother topic, but it kind of warms my soul whenever I talk to a Mormon woman who has felt like she was able to reinvent herself in ways that maybe she felt she wasn't able to at one point of her life.
That made me feel very good. Thank you.
All right. So I think the last thing I want to talk about, so the idea is that I've asked you to come on for this series because I just think there's so much information out there that people just are not that aware of when it comes to sexuality. And so I thought you could, as you're attending some of these classes and flying out to Michigan, you're being very kind to be willing to take some notes for us and just say, here's some of the things that we're learning about and, and maybe even things that, you didn't know. I'm always kind of shocked and surprised whenever I'm still learning something new, and it happens quite often. I'm like, wow, I can't believe we don't know these things about our own bodies or about our orientations, or, we're starting to understand so much about gender and fluidity and just so many different things, about our sexuality. So I thought it'd be fun to kind of follow you as a starting sex therapist and some of the information that you might be able to offer an old timer like me or even our audience. So that's going to be kind of where we head, in the future episodes. But I thought how we would end today's is with you talking a little bit about the SAR experience and what that is. It's
sexual attitude
reassessment. And this is interesting because it is what sets AASECT certification apart from so there are some other sex therapy certifications out there. And I forget now the name of one organization in particular that offers a certification process. It's fairly similar to AASECT. However, it does not require a SAR. And the reason why a lot of people choose to go that route is because SARs oftentimes expose people to material that's uncomfortable, especially from a religious values perspective. So I see a lot of Christian therapists, a lot of religiously identified therapists going this other route. And that's fairly problematic for me because I feel like I had to do that. I had to get down and dirty and gritty and, face my own reactions to some of the material that I was having to see. And although, there was a part of me as I was going through the SAR do I really need to see these kinds of images or be confronted with this type of material to be a good sex therapist? I did have that question, and it was a question we were supposed to be asking ourselves during the SAR. And although maybe the answer to that isn't a hard yes or a hard no, I do have to admit that the process of sitting there with my own discomfort was very helpful to me because I really had to face some things that I had to keep on facing for months, if not years later, as to what my original reactions were, why I felt the way I did, why I, maybe at first was thinking I didn't have to do this. I don't know why I had to do this. Reaction that I had. And it's a little concerning to me, especially from this bias and discrimination lens, which we know plays such a role for so many people, that there are people becoming certified in sexuality that do not have to go through something of this nature. So I'd love to get your take on it. How was it explained to you? I think you've done 2 of them.
Yes.
And maybe some of your perspectives from having done them and what they're about.
Okay. So this is a great point to bring up. When I went to SAR the first time, it was when I was hoping to get into graduate school, desperately bored with dog grooming, wanting to move on with my life, but, being held back by waiting to be accepted into the program. And I just wanted to do something regarding or with something related to sexuality, something that would educate me. And so I went to SAR in San Francisco at the Institute for Advanced Study of Human Sexuality, which I believe is where SAR was created. They originated SAR, and it's become quite popular and important in, as far as AASECT goes, especially. But That was an 8-day SAR. That's almost unheard of today. 8 days, or maybe it was seven or 8 days. It was an amazing experience. Fortunately for me, I had borrowed there's kind of a mini program with DVDs that I had borrowed from Dr. Malin. So I had watched those and had been exposed to very uncomfortable video. It was very old, from the 60s and 70s, but sex is sex, no matter what year it is. So I remember just going, oh my gosh, maybe I'm making the wrong decision here. It was so uncomfortable. But as I watched these videos, they progressively they started out with masturbation, and I was like, okay, that's awkward. And then they talked about couples, and I think gay couples and people. And I just want to preface this by saying this is the reality, whether we like it or not. It went into things like threesomes and group sex and homosexuality. There were videos of live videos, people having sex that were gay or straight or whatever.
And to be clear, these videos are also created, my understanding of the ones usually used in these types of settings are not necessarily mainstream pornography, although that can be included in a SAR, but there are many institutes and the Kinsey Institute and several sexual researchers. Yes. It really started kind of back in the 50s and 60s. It started making videos, and more from an educational perspective in regards of like wanting to study the spectrum of human sexuality.
Yes. And I'm really glad you clarified that. I don't want to give the impression that we were just throwing a bunch of porn and get used to it, everybody. It was definitely not like that. But they kind of, they start out with basic discomfort and move into things that are more and more uncomfortable, not because they want you to be into that, because if you're not, that's okay. But because if you have a client coming into your office and they say, I want to defecate on my lover, you can't react it will shame them. And then you can't help that person. So they kind of desensitize you so that these things don't make you react, and so that you can ultimately be more helpful. I think that's one reason. So as I'm watching,
I would just clarify a little bit your sense of react. You don't want to react with your own personal bias of either disgust or distaste for what other people may find very sexually alluring or exciting or erotic, right? And so,
very much so.
The classic, don't yum my yuck and don't yuck my yum kind of comes to mind. Just for whoever coined that. I wish I knew and give them credit, but I say it often. So
don't yuck my yum. And I use that frequently myself for the same reason with people at work who may not be as comfortable with some of the things that I'm now comfortable with. So because I had been exposed to some of that, when I did go to SAR, it wasn't as difficult as it could have been, but because I had already been a little bit desensitized to it. But the one thing about the SAR that I went to was they had 11 big screen television screens, 11 big screens, and all of them were actually playing. And this is San Francisco, and this is the originator of the SAR. So it's going to be a little more probably graphic, and it was. But 11 big screens showing all different scenes of different types of it was pornography, what we would typically call pornography today in video form. There were people with food fetishes having sex in threesomes and women and men. I mean, it was so overwhelming. And by the end of it, you're like, okay, that porn doesn't even affect me anymore. After that, it doesn't even affect me. I just kind of go, meh, it just does not have the same effect because I was so desensitized. So, and that was to me a good thing, because I don't want to react to sexual media in any way. Just if it's not my thing, it's not my thing. And I'm able to say that and move on. It's not something that glues my attention to it. I don't have to look at it if I don't want to, because it doesn't faze me like it did. But it definitely was an eye opener. We also had a panel each day, and one of them was sex and disability, sex and aging, BDSM, bondage, discipline, sadomasochism. That was probably the most interesting of all of it, because it's definitely not something I was into or am into, but to learn about it and get understanding of it that I didn't have before, it made it less scary to me. Because it was terrifying to me. Who would do that? Now I understand it a lot a lot more. And so I do have clients where I work. I work, by the way, in addiction and recovery services at a human service agency in Ogden, Utah. And I do have clients that are kind of into that. And because of my exposure to it, I was able to refer them to a place where they could participate that was safe, where there's no drugs or alcohol, and so that they could live out their sex lives the way they want without worrying about relapse or drugs being around, that kind of thing. So,
well, and that reaction that you just mentioned, why would anybody do that, is oftentimes what people kind of more on the fringe aspects of sexuality get confronted with by either mental health or medical professionals,
yes.
and why so much of this has been pathologized to the point that we've had a lot of redefinitions of mental health names and diagnoses so that we're not pathologizing, people's sexual tastes just because they tend to differ from maybe what would be considered more norm. So that's super interesting. And I love the fact that you mentioned the substance abuse treatment that you do, because so many times when people are dealing with substance abuse treatment, sexuality in particular is oftentimes very much ignored. And I know you have a lot of thoughts about that in your field for sure. But that's, again, possibly a topic for another
topic for another day. Yes.
Yeah, but going back, so if people are interested, first of all, in a resource to look for educational films around sexuality, I would recommend Sex Smart Films, I think.com. Sex Smart Films. And then the other thing that I want to talk about just briefly, just to challenge if people are kind of like, oh, I'm not sure why they're talking about this or why this is important, or I don't like listening to some of these things that Tammy and Natasha are talking about. I can understand that. Or even, you mentioned the word desensitize, and there's, I think, a lot of people that say, exactly, I don't want to be desensitized.
Right. As I was saying it, that's what I thought was everyone's going to go, no, that's not what I want. Yeah.
And at the same time, I want to just offer a challenge to all of us to consider the last PG-13 movie you spent with a teenager or a preteen that maybe, I'm thinking of The Hobbit or the vampire movies or Hunger Games, where we as a culture are extremely desensitized to violence. And some people consider this a problem as well. And at the same time, we are, believe it or not, even though the news would make us think differently, and there are atrocities that happen that are awful, at the same time, we are less of a violent nation and actually world than ever, even though we have very violent scenes that we look at. And so I just want to just offer a little bit of a challenge, because I think your point that because sexuality can be so taboo, because we say things like you can't ever look at pornography, or if you look at pornography, your brain will be, ruined forever, then sometimes we give those things more power than they deserve. And what you're describing is that after 7 days of having to look at a lot of different stuff, that power was kind of gone for you. That maybe at first it was uncomfortable or tittillating even, they ask us to consider our own arousal, our own reactions. And by the time that you're done, you're kind of like, kind of like people who go to these movies where there's a lot of arm chopping and beheadings and, like millions of people are killed in one war scene, and you're kind of like, So, so I think there is something to at least the point of, on the one hand, yes, we want to be careful what we put into our minds. On the other hand, which for me is horror shows, so I don't want to put that into my mind. I'm sensitive to that. But on the other hand, we don't want to be so taboo or so concerned about desensitization that then we're inadvertently giving more power to images than we need to.
As usual, you have the gift of words, Natasha, because you're my idol when it comes to how you word things is really very important. And I think what you said nailed it. Is when I said desensitize, it sounds scary, especially to Mormons. We don't want to be desensitized to pornography. Okay, that's understandable. But I think the way you said it is actually more accurate in that it took the power away from pornography. It's not scary anymore. And so I don't have to worry about, oh my gosh, if I see a photo of a nude man, it's going to be burned into my brain forever. That's not the case, because it just doesn't have the power over me that it did, because I'm not afraid of it. I don't fight it. I don't care about it. It just isn't my thing or whatever. But I'll tell you, back when I was about to go on a mission and my friends at work were going to take me to dinner to say goodbye, they found some gay pornography out in the parking lot. And I remember sitting there going, no, don't look at it. Don't. And they were laughing and giggling, all these ladies. And I remember thinking, you can't look at it. You're going on a mission. But I saw it from the corner of my eye. And all I remember is this nude man that looked like Ricky Schroeder. And to this day, 20-something years later, 25, 26, 27 years later, I still remember that, because I was trying so hard to not remember that or see it or think about it.
Mm-hmm.
And yet I've seen so much since then because of SAR that it's not the same. I don't even remember it half the time.
Yeah, I think that's the narrative sometimes, right? That we follow if we're taught to fear and if you're taught, if you see this one thing, it's going to, have this huge impact on you, instead of, well, if you see this one thing, okay, you saw it, big deal, move on with your life. It doesn't have to have a big impact on you. We are impressionable. We influence each other. We believe things, especially if people who are telling these things are our parents, or religious leaders, or people that we look up to. And so I think one of the things that people have oftentimes heard me talk about is we want to be careful the narratives that we offer, because they can have the unintentional power of becoming true, and like when you tell a kid often enough that they're stupid or lazy, they start believing those things.
Believe it. Yes.
So you tell people that they're addicts, or that they won't be able to control their sexuality, or that every time a woman walks by with her cleavage showing, that's going to be a problem for their arousal. Now, all of a sudden, you're teaching people how to respond to those things.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, great. So it sounds like you saw the SAR as a positive experience for yourself, that you're glad that you...
It's been life-changing, absolutely life-changing in the positive. Sex used to be so scary for me. I was always afraid, what if my husband looks at porn? I was terrified. And that's a horrible way to live if you think about it, to always be worried, because with the internet, it's so easy for that to happen. They're going to be exposed to pornography and it's all over from there. And once I was able to shake that, once the power was taken away, I don't even think or worry about that. If I were married again, it just would not worry me.
And any of your thoughts as far as how, when you're a mental health professional, right, and you're trying to, on the one hand, get the knowledge that you need to be able to be effective in your profession, and then on the other hand, you're also trying to live up to your own religious values, right? Your own morals and things. Any thoughts from you as far as people who decide to go a different route as far as not doing a SAR, as far as their accreditation is concerned, and how that might impact them?
My first thought is truly they're missing out. In the cohort I'm in now at the University of Michigan, we have a female OBGYN from Saudi Arabia. And she said, I'm gay or straight. I didn't even know there was an option. And then we have a doctor from Kabul, Afghanistan. And these two both were exposed to things that they've never seen. I mean, obviously the OBGYN has seen nude women, but I know this doctor has not seen the things that he saw at SAR. And I know that both of them have been impacted positively. And you couldn't ask for more religious people, but it's been, the way they talk about it, it clearly had an impact on them for the positive. It opened them up a little bit, and yet they still have their values. It didn't change their values. It only helped them be able to cope with it better, if that makes sense.
Right. Yeah. It's impossible to not have values, right? And and I don't think you can ask anybody to not have values in any profession. At the same time, I do think that it is an important question for professionals to ask themselves, do my values, or how I interpret my values, interfere with other people's values? And, being able to offer them especially when it comes to medical treatment or mental health treatment.
Yes.
The types of treatment that they would, best benefit from. So I think that's a very valid thing to be asking yourself if you're wanting to go into these types of professions. And I tend to have a fairly opinionated opinion about that, because I think that you can be incredibly harmful. And all you have to do is think about even some of the people that you just mentioned, if you're going in for help to somebody who has certain values and they're like, well, I can't treat you because that goes against my religious beliefs, and you're stuck with not being able to receive treatment that don't have anything to do with your own religious beliefs, or even do have to do with your religious beliefs. And then that can become even more complicated. Wow. The potential for harm is quite severe. So I don't take that responsibility lightly.
Because as you were talking about that, if you think about, this is obviously another topic and it's a very uncomfortable one, but people who are pedophiles, they want to get help. Where can they go? Most therapists are like, nope, I don't do it. Nope, goodbye, not going to help you. And we're really shooting ourselves in the foot when we don't at least say, you know what, I don't know how to help you with that, but I know someone who can, and let me refer you there and treat them with kindness. We want to be safe, right? We want children to be safe. And if someone is coming in seeking treatment, asking for help, I think it's important that even if it's against our personal values, that we respect that and help them find the help that they need.
Yeah. It gets really tricky with many, many different topics, whether it's abortion, whether it's helping somebody come out, if that's not okay in your own culture, in society. It's transgender rights. It's so many things that interweave between medicine, mental health, and culture and societal norms. So it's a fascinating field.
Yes. And
we're all impacted.
Sure.
Yeah, we're all impacted. Well, Tammy, thank you so much for your time tonight. This has been a fascinating conversation.
It has. It's fun to talk about.
Yeah, I appreciate your honesty and vulnerability with some of your own story and, just kind of your journey towards this field. And I'm excited to have you back to,
Thank you. I'm looking forward to it.
Give us some tips and ideas of things that are being talked about that we might not be completely aware of. So we'll have you back on soon.
That sounds great.
All right.
We took the long road home, turned minutes into miles. And as the evening traveled on, the sunset bathed your smile. We stopped beneath the desert stars, wrapped in each other's arms. Was as simple as I love you, an ordinary, extraordinary truth.
It's been a long road here, a trail with tears, pain and sorrow too.
But through every storm we traveled on, like lovers do. And if sometimes we fell apart, we always came back home. Was as simple as I love you, an ordinary, extraordinary truth. Some people say love is blind and forever is too long. But I see your eyes in every sunrise. Can't imagine life alone. Let's take the long road on together until we're gone. Want you by my side till the day I die and into the beyond. It's as simple as our love is. That's how I wanna go, all wrapped up in the arms of our extraordinary, it's nothing ordinary love. Ordinary. No, it's extraordinary love.